One of the memories that I hold dear is of as a youth in Fresno. I was just old enough to know the immigrant generation before they passed away in the late 1940s and 1950s. Those who made their way across the continent to Fresno. So their faces, their voices, their images are vivid in my mind. Then I knew, of course, the next generation, which was my parents' generation. And for the most part, this blueprint I'm laying out is a blueprint for most of the Armenian families in Fresno as an immigrant generation arrived from Mush, from Bitlis, from Diyarbakir, from Van, from the various cities in Turkish-occupied Armenia, and put down their roots in Fresno. Some did very well, and others did well, but for the most part, no one did poorly. They were an industrious people. They were hardworking. They did what had to be done, fought the prejudice, fought the, as they called, Russian gangs, who they later described to me as white Russians and Germans. And then my generation came on the scene. In my generation, I can only think of one person who did not go to college, whereas in the previous generation, I can only think of 2 or 3 that went to college. So in my generation, we were still aware of who our grandparents were and aware of the immigrant status that they faced when they came. Now, mind you, for the most part, these were people who were not survivors of the genocide. These were people who came before the genocide. For instance, the Karabian family, originally Karabian, the Karabian family came in 1896 after the Red Sultan, Sultan Hamid II, bloody bloodbaths in Turkey where he killed Armenians and the resistance of Zeytun and so forth. And so we didn't hear stories of the genocide growing up. None of us. And we heard stories that made the homeland seem like a land of paradise because they had been told this by their parents, or they were born in those towns when they were, and came to the United States when they were very young. I'm talking about my parents' generation. In my case, both my parents were born in Fresno. My father in Fresno itself, my mother in a farm in Sanger, just outside of Fresno. But they knew where they had come from historically. For instance, my mother's friends were almost all Dikranargetsis. That is to say, the daughters of and sons of those whose families immigrated from Dikranarget. My mother's friends were all people who had immigrated or were the sons and daughters of immigrants who had come from Diyarbakir, the Turkish name for the city. We Armenians call it Dikranarget. And so they were Dikranargetsis. They all kind of hung out together. I know we used to go to my mother's relatives for visits, and they all spoke an Armenian that was difficult for my father, who was a Bitlisi. His family had come from Bitlis, to understand, because they had what I later learned was a Dikranargetsi accent. And they ended most of their names and words with an O. For instance, Zabel was called Zabo. The homeland seemed like a land of paradise because they had been told this by their parents, or they were born in those towns when they were and came to the United States when they were very young. I'm talking about my parents' generation. In my case, both my parents were born in Fresno. My father in Fresno itself, my mother on a farm in Sanger, just outside of Fresno. But they knew where they had come from historically. For instance, my mother's friends were almost all Dikranargetsis. That is to say, the daughters of and sons of those whose families immigrated from Dikranarget in Turkish and Dikranarget in Armenian. In Turkish, Diyarbakir. My mother's friends were all people who had immigrated or were the sons and daughters of immigrants who had come from Diyarbakir, the Turkish name for the city. We Armenians call it Dikranarget. And so they were Dikranargetsis, and they all kind of hung out together. I know we used to go to my mother's relatives for visits, and they all spoke an Armenian that was difficult for my father, who was a Bitlissi. His family had come from Bitlis, to understand, because they had what I later learned was a Dikranargetsi accent. And they ended most of their names and words with an O. For instance, Zabel was called Zabo. Manushag was called Mano. My mother was called Zavo, for Zavart. My cousins, Sarkis was called Sako. This was a characteristic the Dikranargetsis had, and they spoke a different language. My father used to say that he had great difficulty understanding my mother's relatives, and both of them spoke Armenian, but they spoke the Armenian they learned at home. My father's a proper Armenian, my mother's with a Dikranargetsi accent. And so you have that as a backdrop, and then I paid a little more attention to that immigrant generation and to my parents' generation than most young people did. Most of my friends were more interested in how the Fresno Cardinals were doing, or how the Fresno Falcons were doing in ice hockey, and how the Bulldogs, Fresno State Bulldogs, were doing. I was interested in those things, and I collected the programs, and I still have many of those programs to this day. But I was also interested in their stories. And the immigrant generation were stories of what the train ride was coming across the nation after they landed at Ellis Island, or in a few cases in Boston, and how life was when they got to Fresno. My grandmother used to say when they got to New York and somebody gave them a banana, they didn't know what to do. They didn't know whether to eat the outside or to peel it off until it was pointed out to them, because they had never seen a banana in Bitlis. And as a result, I feel those roots are important to me. I have sought out other Bitlisis. I have sought out what I call our first cousins, Vanetsis, because Van is on one end of Lake Van and Bitlis is on the other end. And we get a kick out of it when Vanetsis and Bitlisis see each other, and we call ourselves cousins. The Dikranaghetsis were a much bigger group in the outskirts of Fresno. My mother used to say that Dikranaghetsis are like Bermuda grass. They grow everywhere. And certainly that was true from the comparative size of my mother's family and my father's family. Huge disproportionate difference between my mother's side and my father's side. On my father's side, there were a few Avakians and a few Basmagians, but most were Karabians. The name was changed in the 1920s, and I could never find out why, from Karabian to Karabian. I think they did it because it made it easier to pronounce. They said it's Karabian, Arabian with a K in front of it. And so that was easiest for the non-Armenians, the Odars, to understand and pronounce. My mother's side of the family included all the Tususians, the Chulgians, the Zalians. Stephen Zalian, the filmmaker, is my cousin through my mother. The Tususians changed their name to Tucson. They're a big family. The Chulgians, a huge family, farming and packing family in Fresno. And there were Saroyans in there, but not the Saroyans from the Tbilisi Saroyans of William Saroyan. Although as William Saroyan got more and more famous, they often said we're cousins, but I don't think they were, because they were Dikranaghetsis and William Saroyan was a Tbilisi. Growing up in Fresno was not difficult. It was work-oriented, imposed by our parents, all of us. And we were all sons and daughters of the Armenians who lived in what was then Little Armenia town, which was an area that almost every house was inhabited by an Armenian family. My father and his friend John Elia, an Assyrian name, but a Tbilisi Armenian, John Elia and my dad sat down and drew a map of Fresno. And I have that map, and if you'd like to photograph it, I can, where all the Armenian families, almost all of the old families in Fresno, came from this area that was bounded by streets that I could tick off to you, but they were the original settling place of the Armenian families in Fresno. I'm not counting the ones in the country, which often came from places like Erzurum and Dikranagert, this tracing back to that kept us all more or less in touch with each other. When we went to school, most of us went to Roosevelt High School, but a few went to Fresno High School. There were only four high schools in Fresno. Fresno High School on the north side, Edison High School, which was called Across the Tracks, which was largely inhabited by Mexican Americans and African Americans, and I don't know a single Armenian family where their children went to Edison High School. San Joaquin Memorial, which was for those who wanted a Catholic education, they went to San Joaquin Memorial High School, and then Roosevelt High School, where I went, and a lot of others. Dick Manoogian, Judge Sohegan, Gene Nalbandian, Kenneth Elia, we all went to Roosevelt High School. That was the big dumping ground of the Armenian kids in Fresno. And so we knew each other, and our parents' generation, for some strange reason, pounded into our heads where these others came from. My father would always point out who the Beatleses were. That means Beatlesey means someone from Beatles. He had never been there. He was born in Fresno. He would never see it in his lifetime. I would never see it for different reasons. I wouldn't go there. But Beatles was a real place conjured up in our minds as a wonderful place that we were forced out of. Michael Agopian, Dr. Michael Agopian, with whom I was so close for so many years, was a Kharpetsi. Now, he was actually born in Kharpet, which the English call Harput, and he had a lot of knowledge about Kharpet. And this was because this was drummed into us as young people. When we'd go down the street to the market, when our grandmother would take us down the street to the market, she would point out who the Mushetsis were, who lived here or there, who the Dikranagetsis were, who lived here or there, who the Beatleses were, and they called them Beatles in those days. My aunt and uncle would always say, oh, he's a Beatle, which was anglicized version of Beatlesy. And so we learned all of that. I mean, I learned that the Sagatelians that owned Valley Bakery were Mushetsis. I learned that Michael Agopian's family were Kharpetsis. Why? Because they pointed it out to us. Now, I have no idea why they did that, but they pointed it out to us. And for some reason, having a better than average memory as I had, I kept it in my head. And to this day, when I meet people, at my last high school graduation reunion, I said to Janet Sagatelian, oh, I know, you guys are Mushetsis. She was stunned that I remembered that. But I remembered it because it was always said to us. The Soroyans, William Soroyan, his mother and his sister and his aunts and so forth lived on the street behind us. On M Street. We lived on L Street. My grandmother lived on L Street, and we knew they were Beatleses. They were from Beatles. And Soroyan was very nationalistic about Beatleses. When I was at USC, I went to hear Soroyan speak. I must have been 18 or 19, and the lecture hall was packed. People were sitting in the aisles and standing outside to get a glimpse of this great Pulitzer Prize winner, William Soroyan. And after the speech was over, I went up to him and I said, Bill, I'm Walter Karabian from Fresno. He said, are you John's boy or Frank's boy? Now that was the anglicized name. My father was Hovanes, but called John. My uncle Frank was Antranik, but called Frank. I said, I'm John's boy. He turned around in a booming voice to the audience, people who had no idea what he was saying, and said, this is Hosep and Haganush's grandson. Now, my grandmother, Haganush, I knew well, but my grandfather had died long before I was born, and I had to think for a minute to remember that his name was Hosep. So what happened is he said that, he shouted this out to this audience, and then he looked at me, put his arm around me, and he says, you see this boy? In his veins runs the blood of Beatles. Now, did anyone in that room understand what he was saying? No one. There were less than 10 Armenian kids in all of USC in those days, in 1956 and 57. But this was very real to him. And in his will, Remember, Saroyan wanted his ashes to be buried in Bitlis. Now, they've made some adjustments to that over the years. I think half his ashes are in Fresno, the other half in Yerevan. But he wanted his ashes to be buried in free Bitlis, when Bitlis is free. Now, this nationalism we learned from the nationalists of the previous generation. Most of them were too busy naming their sons and daughters names that would fit them better into society, like Walter and my brother Lawrence and my sister Patricia, rather than giving us the Armenian names that they had been given, but they used English names in place of them. One of my aunts was Satanig. She went by the name of Hazel. I said my father's name was Hovanes, and he went by John. My uncle's name was Antranik. He went by Frank. And my other aunt's name was Araxi, and she went by Roxy. Now, why, I don't know. They must have felt a discrimination, and they tried to anglicize themselves, even though they didn't change their last name, and a lot of Armenian families in Fresno did. My father and mother never got farther from Fresno than Los Angeles or San Francisco, and that was a rare occasion to go to San Francisco and see my cousin Harold Perichin and my cousin Merrill Perichin, who were at, well, there you go, there's an example. Perichanian was their name. They became Perichin, who were in school at Stanford. And they came down to Los Angeles when I graduated from USC and from USC Law School. But these were major treks for them, and something that some wonderful man, Zakar Apelian, married to a cousin of mine, said, the Fresnotsis think if they leave Fresno, Fresno will run away from them. And they clung to it, and Fresno was a laughingstock, a joke for a while. Then it became a very important agricultural producing county, the most productive county in the United States, and became a big hub city, which is now a metropolitan city. So this is what I remember. Strong-willed, hard-working people. My mother used to say, when your father comes home for lunch, if you're not at the table, I lock the door, you don't get fed. She used to had a saying in Turkish, I'm sure, it just didn't sound like Armenian, that was, the chickens that are not in the chicken coop when the seed gets thrown do not get fed. And she didn't care how much you cried or complained. She was cooking for one man, my father. And if you weren't there, you didn't get fed. You waited hungry until dinner time. They made us do chores in the house and around the house. They forced us to work. We worked all the time. My childhood, I remember, is doing chores and working, going out to the Barbarian ranches and picking walnuts on Saturdays, and going out and picking oranges on Sunday. This was life for my generation in Fresno. And so when the opportunity came to go away and go to USC, of course, I took it in an instant. And it changed my life dramatically.